The Rocker. I was taken to a junkyard city by a guy from Craigslist where his friends waited to mug me. When I was 15, I was obsessed with trying to be the next great rock star, and I spoke a lot about it to people around me. At the time, I was living with my brother and his wife. I'd go back to living with my parents when I was 17, and one day, my brother surprised me. For my birthday, he bought me a guitar and an M player. It was an extremely cool thing he did, and I knew I could begin practicing. But at the same time, I felt that I needed to get myself a microphone, and so I sent myself to Craigslist. I hopped on my computer and went to Craigslist. It was only 3 scrolls down that I found a page that looked like the most interesting to me. It had no images of a person, just the avatar of a monkey. The name also couldn't have been the real person's name, because the name was 346 Duster. The page didn't even have the image for the microphone, but the thing that caught my attention was just how cheap it was. You see, it was my first time using Craigslist, and I started to learn how things work with the website. So even though I knew all these things were suspicious, I went on with the sale anyway. After all, I assumed the worst that could happen would be me being sold a wire or something. I was mistaken. I sent the man an email, and before I could even get up, I got an email back. He told me that I could go get the microphone the same day, and he showed me where I could find his place, which was actually close to my house. However, I was uncomfortable with meeting at his place, so I asked if we could maybe go meet at the local burger joint. He sent back an email saying sure. I was sitting there at the point and trying not to look nervous when a guy walked up to me. The man was bald with a pot belly, and on his head he wore sunglasses with a pot belly. And when I shook his hands, they felt like they were wet. By then, I just had enough of the interaction and I wanted to go with him. He said he had the thing in the car, and he took me to the car. But when we got to the car, he looked around and returned empty-handed. He said he must have left the microphone in his living room couch. I told him to never mind then, but he said no, I'd already paid. We can go get it. He said his home was just a walking distance away, and so we walked off. I thought as we walked it would get more comfortable, but crazy enough, it just got worse. He kept muttering to himself, glancing over to me till I looked at him. Then he looked away. He was also sweating, and I knew it for a fact. This guy intended on doing something to me. Then I saw where he was leading me, to the dirtiest part of town. I asked if it was safe there, and he hummed. It could have been a yes or no. I didn't know what the humming meant, but I knew I wasn't going in there. So I stopped walking. He walked on, and when he was a few paces away, he noticed I wasn't coming. He asked me what was the matter, and I told him it would be better if I waited a distance away. And then his eyes started to twitch. He asked me what I was talking about and asked I come on, but I said no. He smiled for about 30 seconds, just looking into my eyes, and I started getting really uncomfortable. Finally, he sighed and said, fine. Then he said I can just stay there, and he walked off. I got a sinking feeling he wasn't coming back, but I didn't want to rudely walk off. I was still standing there when I heard shuffling. I turned around and saw that to my left and right, there were about 3 guys, and they were all looking at me. Then I looked to the apartments, and I saw the windows of the apartment he'd walked into. He was standing there and looking at me from the window, and the guy started walking towards me. I turned and literally ran away from there. When I looked back, I saw that 2 of the guys gave chase, but then they seemed to give up and kicked the dirt in anger. But I was gone. Till now, I don't know what they'd been meaning to do to me. The depressor. A strange person from Craigslist really wanted to visit my apartment. When I was first leaving my parents' house to go to college, my parents were so sad about the thing, and they were also very nervous about me leaving alone. And so they bought me so many things. They bought me an apartment, they bought me a car, they bought me pretty much everything I needed. And they bought even a bit more than that. I was too shy to tell them no though, and I decided that I'd just sell the remaining stuff when I arrived at my college. And so I did. The Friday after I arrived, I went to Craigslist and started selling my kitchen fridge. We already had a fridge at the apartment I was going to. And literally after I pressed the send out message, I got an email. It happened so fast that for a time I thought maybe I'd accidentally sent the email to myself. But no, there was definitely a message from a client wishing to buy something from me. Naturally, I was ecstatic, and I started speaking to them. They asked how much I wanted it for, and I gave them the price. I expected them to complain about the price being too high, and I know it was, but I just bought the fridge, so I thought it had to be pricey. But the person didn't complain. The next email they sent me merely asked where I lived, and honestly, that was when my red flags started going up. Not only did they not intend on complaining, but they also immediately wanted to come to my place rather than I go to theirs. I told them that I could have it transported to them, but they were insistent. And so I finally surrendered and gave them my location. A massive mistake. I put the laptop away and I got up to make myself coffee. After the coffee, I started pouring water for the bath, and I received a phone call. It was from some guy who I've never met before. He had a rather deep voice, but for some reason, he was whispering. I asked where he got my number from, and he told me that he was the guy who bought the fridge. By then, I started feeling rather creeped out. I asked him what he wanted, and he said that he'd come to pick up the fridge. And I couldn't believe my ears. It had been 2 hours and he was already there? Naturally, I was starting to get creeped out, so I decided to let him just this whole thing over with. I went outside to meet with him. I walked around the road and then I saw a man, a tall man wearing a blue hoodie. He looked to be trying to hide at the corner there, and when he saw me, he asked my name. By then, I really wanted to say no, but I admitted that it was me, and he nodded. He said he'd take the fridge and he wanted to pick it up now. Keep in mind, he hasn't seen the fridge, and also, as big as he was, I wasn't sure if he could carry that thing in his hands. So I was very skeptical that he wanted me to take him to my place simply for the fridge. I brought up these things to him, and when he saw he couldn't turn me, I immediately noticed the shift in the look in his eye. He told me that I should go inside and show him that fridge because he has already made plans to pay for it. I told him that I'd decided to keep it, and that's when he snapped. He took 2 strides at me. His eyes were red. I hate to say it, but I shriveled like a rat when he pulled his hand out of his pocket and I saw what was clearly a switchblade. That's when the campus guard arrived, asking if everything is fine. I said yes, and we were just going our separate ways, and I hurried off with the campus guard. When I looked back at the guy, he was still standing in the middle of the walkway, his face now a mess of fury. And that was how I survived that. The Traveler. Craigslist got me marked at knife point in my own house. My name is William, and I don't really know how exactly to begin this story. So I guess it begins with the fact that when I was in high school, my school was too far away. I had no choice but to get an apartment near my school to attend. A friend of mine heard this, and he told me about a brother of his who also wanted an apartment at the area. So his brother and I started living together, and we split the rent money between us, but he and I aren't particularly close. He's a bit talkative, and I guess I bore him, so we don't speak much. As a result, I don't know much about him. So on a particular Friday afternoon, I was doing my homework on our kitchen table when I heard a knock on the door. I went to open it, and standing there was a guy a few years older than me. His eyes were droopy and his lips were chapped. He told me that he'd come to pick up the laptop. Now, I had no idea what he was talking about. I asked him what laptop. He said the laptop he bought from Ed. He explained that he had spoken to Ed on Craigslist and he bought a laptop from him, so he'd come to buy it. And since Ed and I don't talk much, I didn't know whether this was true or not. I should have stepped aside and let him in, but the guy's face just didn't sit right with me. His eyes were jolting back and forth, and he was rubbing his hands together as if to warm himself, even though it was afternoon. But I stepped aside and let him in. Immediately he walked to the table where my laptop was, and he took it. And that's when I realized I could have made a mistake. My laptop and Ed's aren't the same, and if this guy truly came from Craigslist, he would have known. I asked who he really was. He said he just told me. I asked him which laptop did Ed sell him. And that's when he started getting angry and started yelling about me wasting his time. I told him to stay there, and I pulled out my phone to call Ed. I asked Ed if he sold a laptop to someone on Craigslist, and Ed asked me, "Craigslist? What's that?" And that was when my blood ran cold. I turned around to look at the guy, and I saw him holding a long knife in his hand. The guy took the laptops, my phone, and put them in bags. Then he left the house, but the cops found him rather quickly, because Ed heard what was happening through the phone, and he called the cops. The guy was a friend of a guy from our school, and he heard of our unique living arrangements, and decided to take advantage. Well, it soon became clear that we couldn't do it anymore, and so now I just go to a different school. The trial. Craigslist introduced me to monsters. I went on Craigslist once, trying to buy myself a PS5. This was back when people were hoarding their consoles, and I just didn't know where I could get myself one. Then I remembered that my sister got herself a phone from Craigslist at a super cheap price, and the phone was in great condition, so I thought I should get myself one there too. My sister warned me that when it came to online things, I should not buy anything too cheap, but at the same time, she wouldn't give me money for anything expensive, so of course I bought the cheapest PS5 I found. Not only was it cheap, but it was an actual PS5. I must have browsed for 2 days on Craigslist before I found an interesting advert. It was a PS5 that was crazy cheap, and even better, the person lived about 19 minutes from my home. The one downside though is that the location he was sending it from was one of the worst places in town. But it was the best offer, and so I took it. I spoke to the guy, and he only sent me his address, nothing else. Well, I could appreciate someone who was more business-minded. When walking to his place, you can sense the change in atmosphere immediately when you walk into the street of that neighborhood. And when I arrived at his house, he was sitting on the lawn and absolutely smoking weed. We introduced each other, and I could tell he was somewhat annoyed by my arrival. I asked to see it, and he took me inside, showing me the PS5. He then asked for the money, and I said I'd send it to his bank. Then his face turned. I asked him what was the problem. He said that it won't work that way. I should bring the money physically to him. I had no idea why he wouldn't accept an online transaction, and when I asked it, he muttered something about police, so I still didn't know why even after he answered. But he told me that there was a bank nearby that I could go check out, and he directed me. His directions were completely off, by the way. I spent 2 hours walking around the parks and parking lots before I finally found out Google Maps, and I was led in the exact opposite direction to the bank. Then, as I was getting the money in the bank account, I heard a small "don't move." I looked back to see a guy wearing a coat and black beanie. He was holding a knife. To say I was scared would be misleading. I was petrified, I couldn't believe what was happening, and the guy told me to check how much money was in the card. Then he made me take it all out. And when he was done, he asked if that was all. Then he turned and he walked off. After that, I stood there for a while, not believing what had just happened. And when I looked around me, I could see people going about their day, not seeming to care. I went back to the PS5 guy and I told him what happened. He looked very angry at me and told me that he didn't care, he just wanted the money, and only then could I get the PS5. He asked I explain what happened to him, and so I did it again. When I told him about the beanie, he asked if it had a Z on it, and I agreed. He told me that was his beanie. It was borrowed by somebody. He told me to stay there, and he left. Almost an hour later, he came back, and he told me I could go get the PS5, and then he gave me back my money. Except it wasn't all of it. He took the PS5, and the rest? I don't know. He said this was all he could get, and although I am sure he was lying to me, I was just too numb. I left that place before any more could happen.